Alright, in today's lecture, I have a special treat for you guys. I'm going to be teaching you how to draw animation styled artwork. Now, a lot of you have asked me how to create this style of artwork, and that's why I've included this lecture in the course. So let's go ahead and get started. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just sketch a character for you guys and sort of walk you through what I'm doing. Then we're going to go ahead and break it down, and we're going to draw a second character, and we're actually going to look at how it's drawn in detail and how we can change different things to make it look like a different character. So when I draw my characters, I always start off with a circle for the head, and then I go ahead and I add in my chin. Now, depending on where I want my character looking, that's going to determine where my chin and the center line of my face is going to be. So in this case, my character is going to be looking more in this direction and a little downwards. So my center line is going to come right down like so, and the chin is going to come down like here, and there's my jawline. So now I have a chin, a jawline, and the shape of my head. Next, I like to go ahead and add in my neck. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a neck in there. And then I can go ahead and bring that into my shoulders. And I'm not going to worry too much about the shoulders for now. We're only going to focus on the head. So next, what I like to do is I like to go ahead and figure out where my ears are going to be. So I'm going to place my ears probably right about there. And they're just going to be basic egg shapes or upside down egg shapes. So there's my ear. The other one can't be seen because it's behind the head. Next, what I like to do is I like to find my center line for my eyes. And since my character is looking downwards, that means this line, instead of being horizontal, it's going to be slanted just a bit. And it's also going to be circular. So I like to draw an oval to start to create that form through my character's head like so. And so right now at this point, we can kind of see through that character's head. Now also, I'd like to note that I'm using a blue colored pencil because this is what animators use to draw their undersketches. Once we draw our undersketch, we'll go ahead and go in there with either a darker pencil or a red pencil to add in the final lines. So now that I have the eye line in there, I'm going to go ahead and find where my nose will be. So my nose will be a little bit further than 1/3 of the way down from that line to my chin. So I'm going to put my nose right about there. And then I'm going to go ahead and add my mouth in right there between those two lines and my chin. Then I'm going to go ahead and add in my eyes. So for my eyes, I usually like to start off with basic circles, and this one right here is going to be a perfect circle, and this one is going to be more of an oval because we're seeing more of that side of the eye. Next, what I like to do is I like to go ahead and shape my eyelids. So since we're looking at this at an angle, we're going to go ahead and shape this eye in a different way than this eye is going to be shaped. So this eye gets shaped like so. And then this eye right here is going to be shaped just a little bit different, just because of the perspective we're seeing them in. All right, great. Next, what I like to do is I like to go ahead and draw in a little oval for my nose. So I'm going to add an oval for my nose just like so, and I'm drawing that in pretty lightly. But in my animation style, I really like to use ovals as the base for my noses. Then I can go ahead and sort of darken in where I want my lips to be. And I think my character is going to be smiling just a little bit. All right, great. Next, what I want to do is I want to add in a little bit more of a cheekbone there. And then I'll go ahead and curve that back in. And then I'm going to go ahead and add in a little bit more of a brow and a little bit more of a forehead, just like so. I can also add in a little bit more of a cheekbone. And next, what I want to do is I want to add in my eyes, or the pupils and the iris. So in this case, my character is going to be looking straight at the camera and a little bit up because she's looking down. So we're going to go ahead and add that in, just like so. Now, your iris placement on your characters is something that you're going to have to practice and work on so they look like they're looking in the direction that you want them to. So now let's go ahead and move on to this one. And in this case, she's going to have a little bit of her iris covered by this eyelid. Then I can go ahead and add in my eyebrows. So I'm going to go ahead and first add in sort of a rectangular box like so, and then a line that comes off like that. And I want to add some expression into her face. So I'm going to bring this eyebrow down just like so. Now she has a lot more expression. The next thing I like to do is to add in my character's hair. So we have her jawline right there, and then we have her ear. And so then starting there, we're going to have her sideburn. And I like to just sketch out that hairline first off. And this line up here is going to be a little bit curved. Now that we have the hairline, we can go ahead and decide what type of hair we want our character to have. So in this case, I think my character is going to have relatively long hair, and I think I'm going to put a part right about there. And then I'm going to go ahead and start sketching in some really light lines because I'm not sure how I want this to go yet. But what you can do is you can start sketching in some really light lines and just playing with some curves and whatever you want. Just trying to figure out how you want that hair to flow. Then I'll go ahead and add the other side of the part. All right, I'm kind of liking the shape of that hair. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start darkening in a little bit more where I want that hair form to be. And this hair right here is actually going to come behind that ear. And then we'll go ahead and add some more of this hair right here. And we can go ahead and do this side also. And you'll notice that I'm really playing with the shape of the hair. So it really comes down to the shape of the hair being the most important part, not the actual individual lines. So as you can see right here, rather than just having the hair coming over like so in a round shape, it actually comes up and then it curves in the opposite direction, and then it starts to smooth back out, and then it comes almost straight down. And that creates a very interesting shape for us. So now what we can do is we can go ahead and start adding in some more detail with our darker pencil. Real quick, I'm going to go ahead and sketch in a little bit more of her body. So I'll add in some arms in there, maybe a little bit of a shoulder. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of a collarbone, some neck muscle. All right, perfect. Now let's go ahead and grab our red colored pencil. And I like to use red because I just think it looks interesting. If you want, you can go ahead and use a normal dark pencil, but in this case, I'm going to go ahead and use my red colored pencil, and I'm going to go ahead and start darkening in the areas I know I want darkened. So I usually like to start with the eyes because I want that to be the focal point, and I make that the darkest area by adding in some really dark and thick eyelashes. So even if this is a guy, I always add in really dark and thick eyelashes. Then I'll go ahead and start to darken in the iris of the eye. And I want to make sure that I leave out an area for a highlight. So there's my highlight right there. And I'll go ahead and fill in around that. And the same with this side, it's going to get a little bit of a highlight there. Just like so. And I can add a little bit more of a swoop off the edge of that eyelash. And I'm going to also fatten that a little bit more and connect it. All right, great. Now let's go ahead and move on to the eyebrows. So I'm going to go ahead and darken those eyebrows in. And then I'm going to go ahead and darken in her forehead. Now this is a good time to reshape things the way you want them. So like that forehead, I brought that in just a tiny bit more. I'll go ahead and add in this cheekbone that comes all the way down to the chin. Then we can go ahead and add in the jawline. And generally, girl characters are going to have much pointier chins than men characters. Next, I'm going to go ahead and add in the detail on my nose. So first off, I like to start off with the nostril. So the nostril is just a small little line like so. And then I add the bottom part of the nose. And then I add that edge of the nostril. And then I like to draw on that oval just a little bit darker with my red. And then I like to add a shadow on the bottom of that nose, just like so. And then I can go ahead and connect from this eyebrow all the way down to my nose with a little bit of a curved line, just like that. And I'd like to add a little bit of shadow in there also. Next, I'm going to go ahead and add in my lips. So these lips are going to be very similar to drawing realistic human lips, which this is why I say it's important to understand how to draw realistically if you want to draw like an animation artist, because you need to understand how real life works. If you don't know how to draw humans in real life, you're going to have a really hard time drawing an animation character because you're not going to understand how each part of the human face works. Then I'm going to go ahead and add in a little bit of blush in there. I like to add this in because I think it makes my characters look a little bit more interesting and charming. So even if I'm doing a guy, I usually add a little bit of blush in there on the cheeks, and sometimes I have that come across the nose and onto the other cheek, just like so. You can also go ahead and add some freckles in there. I think that adds a little bit of character to your character, but you don't have to add that in, and you don't have to add that in on every character, but I generally like to add in freckles because I just like them. Then I'm going to go ahead and add in the ear. And if you remember how we drew a realistic ear, we can go ahead and sort of copy that, but we want to simplify it in this case because it's an animation character. So that's pretty simplified. Then I'm going to go ahead and start to add in my hair. So starting with right here, I'll start adding in the hair, and I can add a little bit more detail there, so maybe a little bit more on the sideburn. I'll just continue these lines down and try to keep them as nice and smooth and flowing as possible. I don't want to make it too dark because I'm trying to keep those eyes the focal point in the sketch. And I can go ahead and add in that shoulder, add in her neck. And in these background areas of her hair, we can go ahead and darken that since it'd be quite a bit of shadow back there. We'll add in her collarbone, and her collarbone is just a basic little sort of U shape, and then a line coming off that. There's that arm. Then we can go ahead and add this side of her hair. Now, if you want to get really good at animation art, what I recommend you do is find a ton of pictures of other artists' animation art and copy it. You can even copy mine if you want, I don't care. But don't take credit for other artists' artwork, but just copy it to understand how they draw their pictures and how they use shape to create their artwork. This is going to help you out immensely. When I first wanted to learn how to draw animation artwork, this is what I did. I spent about 4 months just sketching out tons of other artists' drawings, and from that I picked up how to create like the eyes, the nose, and I learned a ton of different styles, and then I sort of mashed those styles together and then incorporated my own little flair, and now I have a little bit of my own style of animation artwork. Alright, so now we've created our character. Now I want to break this down a little bit further for you and take it a bit slower, because that was a little bit quick. So when I draw my animation characters, like I said, I like to start off with the head. So the head, like we said, is just a very basic circle. So we draw our circle in, and in this case, we're going to draw our character from the front. So next what I like to do is I like to go ahead and add in my chin. So it's basically going to be like drawing a realistic human head. So we add in sort of that arrow type shape at the bottom of our circle. Next what we want to do is we want to go ahead and find the middle of our line, or the middle of our head, vertically, and then we want to find the horizontal one. So horizontal one is about there, maybe a little bit lower. All right, perfect. So now we have the setup for our head. We can also add in the detail for our neck. So the neckline should be a little bit further in from the edge of the head. And we don't want the necks to be too long. That's something that a lot of people make a mistake about, is making the necks too long. Now, if this is a style choice, that's totally okay. But in most cases, you want your neck to be relatively shorter than you would probably make it normally. All right, so now we have our neck and our shoulders. Next, let's go ahead and add in the eyes. Now, the eyes are very important when it comes to your character, and it's mostly the shape that matters. So how do we create different shaped eyes? Well, let's come over here to the side real quick, and let's try sketching out a few different eyes. So the kind of eyes we did on this girl was sort of an upturned eye. So if you watched the lecture on how to draw eyes, you saw we went over 5 different styles of eyes. So we're going to do the upturned eye. So if you remember, the upturned eye is basically comes up like so, and it comes back down like so. And so we have a line going through the 2 corners of our eye, but rather than being straight and horizontal, they actually go diagonally. And that's the type of eyes we have on this girl. Now, a lot of the times this will create a more attractive type character, but not always. But in most cases, if you want a really attractive type looking character, you're going to want to add in an upturned eye like this. Now, what other kind of eyes can we do? Well, we can also do eyes that have a large top like so and have a large bottom like so. We can also do other types of eyes where they're almost just like an oval with a little bit of a tear duct there. And then we could add in a pupil like so. Let's try adding a pupil to this one. So we'll add that in like so. And then let's go ahead and add a pupil to this one. Also, another thing to take note on is that the eyelashes and the eyebrows are very important on an animation character. So if there are no eyelashes, it's going to look really boring and bland. So let's go ahead and add that in. So generally, I just like to lump it up into one basic shape. So I like to have it curve off the edge a little bit like so, and then I like to draw a line right across the top like this, and then I just go ahead and fill that shape in. And so I'm not doing every individual actual eyelash, I'm just doing one basic shape. Then on the bottom, I like to add a little bit of a dark line like so, but I don't continue that all the way around. I just want a little area that's darker. If you continue it all the way around, it's gonna look like too much. Let's go ahead and try it on this one. So we can go ahead and add in our eyelash shape like so. And then we can go ahead and fill that in. Go ahead and darken that pupil a little bit more. And then we can go ahead and add a little bit of a darker area on this bottom eyelash. And in some cases, you don't even have to add a darker line. You can just leave that out completely. So let's try that on this eye. So if I go ahead and add in my eyelash like so, and then I'll just leave out that bottom area. And sometimes that looks really good too. So now let's go ahead and add in the eyes on our character. So what we want to do is we want to make our eyes a little bit larger than they would normally be. Now, you can create whatever style of animation artwork you want, but in this case, I'm teaching you how I like to draw my style of animation artwork, and I like to make my eyes bigger. So whether it's a guy or a girl, my eyes tend to be bigger. So I'm going to go ahead and start by drawing a circle like so. Same on this side. And then I like to find where my eyelids are. So in this case, I'm going to be using this type of an eye. So I'm going to go ahead and draw that up like so. And so I like to start the corner where my tear duct would be on this straight horizontal line. And then I like to end this corner just a little bit above that. And then we can go ahead and bring that back down like so. Same with this side. So we'll go ahead and add that in just like so. And we'll go ahead and bring that back down. So now we have the basic shape for our eyes. We can also add in the iris, and we can have the iris looking wherever we want. We can have it looking forward, or we can have it looking off in this direction. In this case, I'm going to have it looking off in this direction because I want to demonstrate to you how the iris changes as it curves or turns around the eyeball. So if we have it looking up here, it's actually going to turn into more of an oval shape because it's in perspective. And so as that circle curves around that that sphere, you actually get more of an oval shape. So let's go ahead and add that in on the other side too. We can go ahead and darken in the eyelashes just a little bit more and the bottom eyelashes. Next, I like to add in the nose. So the nose is going to be a little bit around halfway between this line and this line. You can actually bring that down even just a little bit more if you want. But then, like I said, I like to use an oval as my nose. And depending on what kind of character you're doing, if you're doing a guy, it will probably be a much bigger nose. But if it's a girl, I like to keep it pretty small, somewhere between these two lines. And if it's a guy, you could do a really big circle. It just depends on what you want to do. You can play around with it. So then I get that oval in there, and next I like to add in my lips. Now for my lips, I usually like to start off with just shading a little bit of an area, kind of the shape of my lips, and try to play with where I want those lips to be. So in this case, I think that's pretty good, but I'm actually going to bring it up just a little bit so it looks like she's sort of smirking. And I can go ahead and add a little line like so. Then I can go ahead and detail those lips in just a little bit further. So I like to just add in the top part of the lip, which is darker because the light source is coming from the top, so it's getting a nice cast shadow. And in this case, we can actually add in some teeth in there to make her look like she's smiling. Now, her teeth are going to stay in the same position, and her mouth is going to be a little bit lopsided because she's smirking or smiling. But in this case, her teeth are actually going to start right there, and then her other teeth are going to come all the way over here. And then we'll go ahead and add in the bottom lips. So we need to add in that bottom line first, and we add in the shadow underneath those lips, like so. So now we have some lips and some teeth also. Next, let's go ahead and add in our ears. So our ears need to be lined up with the eyes. So basically the ear starts at the top of the eyes and it ends down by the bottom of the nose. Now she would have some huge ears if we did that, so you can always break rules when you're creating animation artwork. So I'm going to go ahead and make my ears half that size, so her ears are going to be like so. Then I'll add the other ear right over here. Next, we can go ahead and reshape the jaw if we want, because I don't really like the way her jaw is shaped. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and round that out a little bit more. And then I'm going to go ahead and round her cheeks out a little bit more also. So it's just going to turn into one big round shape. Then we can go ahead and find where our eyebrows are. So I'm trying to decide what kind of an expression I want this girl to have. And I think in this case, we're going to go ahead and have a relatively surprised look. So I'm going to lift up her eyebrows pretty high, like so. I'll go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. Great. Then let's go ahead and find the hairline. So I'm going to go ahead and add first the curved line like so for the top hairline. And then I'm going to go ahead and add in the sides that go all the way down to the sideburns. And then we can go ahead and add in whatever type of hairstyle we want. Now in this case, I think I'm actually going to give her an afro. So I actually want to add a headband in there. So I'm going to draw a curved line that goes all the way around the head like so. And then I'm going to go ahead and draw that headband in there, like so. Then we can go ahead and add our afro. So our afro is going to be a basic shape that comes around like this. And I recommend that you look at reference for your hairstyle. That will really help you. Because I know I had a really hard time drawing hair when I first started drawing animation art. But once I drew a lot of different characters with a lot of different hairstyles, I started to build up a visual library of hairstyles. So now we have that hair, we can go ahead and detail the texture out. So we can add a nice textured contouring line for her afro. All right, great. I'm gonna go ahead and darken in those ears too. And maybe add a little bit more detail, so a little bit of a bump and let that curve around. Perfect. All right, so next what we can do is we can go ahead and grab our red, and we're going to go ahead and detail that in further. But before I do that, I actually want to darken in this hair because we want to create that contrast between each part of our character. So the hair is darker, like so. Then we can grab our red one, or we can, in this case, actually use a dark colored pencil. So I'm going to use this one. It's an 8B pencil. So it's relatively darker, and then I'm going to go ahead and detail this character in. So I like to start with the eyes, like I said before. So I'm going to go ahead and first draw an oval around those two shapes. And sometimes I like to leave the actual dark part of the eyes light, because I think it looks really interesting. I'm not sure why, but it's just sort of my style choice. And then I like to go ahead and add in those dark eyelashes. And in some cases, you don't have to have this curving off sort of a shape. You can just add in a dark line, and that'll make it appear like they're not wearing so much makeup, or possibly like they're not wearing any makeup at all, depending on how long and thick their natural eyelashes are. Then I'll go ahead and add in this other bottom line like so. And I like to bring this shape down a little bit further, all the way to the tear duct. Then I'm going to go ahead and add in the eyebrows. Now these eyebrows are a little bit off, because if you look here, this eyebrow is coming a little bit further than that corner of the eye, and this one is a little bit further back than that corner of the eye. So I want to go ahead and bring this eyebrow back just a little bit like so, and then I can go ahead and finish drawing those in. Do the same with this one. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and add in the nose. So for the nose, from a front view, what we want is we want to go ahead and first add in a little line for nostril on that side and a little line for nostril on that side. Then I like to draw two lines coming off like so. And then I like to add in sort of a triangle shape, so a shape that kind of moves up like so. And then I like to shade that in. Then what I like to do is I like to go ahead and connect a line from my eyebrow all the way down to my nose, but you don't have to add that in, but if you want, you can. Next, let's go ahead and do the mouth. So I add in that darker shadow on the top lip. Then I'm going to go ahead and add that dark shadow within the mouth, because there aren't any teeth right there. The teeth are only right there. And then I'm going to go ahead and darken in the bottom shadow on that lip and also this bottom line on the lip. Then we could go ahead and further shape out this head. So I'm going to go ahead and darken in these lines like so. Same with that side. And the simpler you can make your shapes, generally the better it's going to be. So if you can round your whole face out into one shape, it's going to look a lot better and simpler. Next, I'm going to go ahead and darken in that headband. If we want, we can even add some detail on there, so sort of a design. So I'm going to add in some sort of interesting stuff on that headband. And then we can go ahead and detail out the neck, so I'll darken those lines in. Add in those shoulders. We can add in a little line for her neck muscle also, like so. And then we can go ahead and darken in this contouring line for our afro. Now, real quick, before we end this lecture, I want to demonstrate to you some different styles of noses, mouths, and eyebrows. So we went over a couple of different styles of eyes, but let's go over a couple of different styles of other parts of the face. So let's start with the nose. So like I said, I like to generally do a small oval for the girl's nose, and then I like to add the edges for the nostrils, and then a little hole at the bottom, or a little line for the nostril holes, and then I like to add sort of a dark triangle in there and fill that in. And then I like to go ahead and curve that out like so. So that's a girl nose that I like to create, but let's say you're doing a guy. Well, we can go ahead and draw in a large circle like so, and then two smaller circles. We can add in the edges for the nostrils. Then we can go ahead and add in the nostril holes. And then we can go ahead and add in the bottom of the nostril like so. And then we can go ahead and choose our shape that we want the bottom to look like. So we can go ahead and fill that in like so with shadow. You can even add a line up there like so, maybe a little bit of line there. So there's like a male's type of nose, but there's all different types of noses. So you can really play around with this. Now what about the mouth? Well, the mouth, you can increase the size of the mouth, you can increase the size of the lips, you can change the way the mouth is shaped or whether it's smiling or not. So let's say that we wanted to do a mouth that was completely smiling. Well, what we would do is we'd start off with a straight line like so. And a lot of people think that smiles are curved lines like so, but they're not. They're actually straight lines across at the top, and then the bottom is curved. And then we're going to go ahead and add in the shape of our lips. So we start with the top lips, like so. And then we'll go ahead and add the bottom part of the lip. So the bottom part gets a little bit of some shape in there. And then we can add in the bottom lip. Just like so. And then we can add in those teeth. So generally, the further towards the corner of the mouth you get, the darker it's going to become. Then that can slowly fade into the white of the teeth, like so. And then I like to add in the bottom line for the bottom teeth. And then you can either just shade this in for the back teeth, because usually your bottom teeth are behind your front teeth, or you can go ahead and darken that in all the way. I like to darken it in all the way because I feel like it makes it look simpler. You can also add a little bit of shadow underneath this edge, and then you can go ahead and darken in the top part of your lips like so. And you can add a little bit more shading down here on the bottom. But that would be some smiling lips or a smiling mouth. Now let's have a look at eyebrows really quick. Now with eyebrows, you can add in all different types. So we have these really skinny thin ones, but you can also add in ones that are, let's say, a lot thicker. So in this case, we can add in some thicker ones. We can curve those over like so, and then fill that in. You can also add in really thin ones. So you can almost just do lines like so. Or if you're doing a guy, you can make them really bushy. So let's say that this is a guy's eye, even though I know the eyelashes are really thick on it, but we can go ahead and add in some really bushy eyebrows like so. And we don't want to taper it off like we did with these ones. With guy ones, I usually like to just cut it off at a straight line or have a very small taper. And we can go ahead and draw some lines for the bottom. Then I like to just draw those in with really thick, dark lines like so. And that might be a guy's eyebrow. Alright, so that brings us to the end of this lecture. So in this lecture, I shared with you how I create my animation styled characters. So first off, I like to break it down into the basic shapes, and then I like to go in there and add in detail like the eyes, the nose, the mouth, then the eyebrows, and then I add in the hairstyle, usually last. And I also like to draw with a blue colored pencil and then add a darker colored pencil or a red colored pencil on top of that to solidify all of my lines. All right, your assignment for this lecture is to go ahead and draw your own animation styled character. If you need to look at somebody else's and use it as reference, that's fine. Definitely use mine as reference if you need to. Then I want you to go ahead and post that to either the Q&A section of the course or the Facebook group and let us all see what you've created. Thanks for watching this lecture.